Hello, everyone. I just would like to welcome you as you join this webinar, and we will get started in a couple of seconds here. Okay, it seems like we have quite a few people in, so I would like to welcome everyone to this webinar on the future of MEL, or Monitoring, Evaluation, and Learning. My name is Laurel, and I'm the Operations Manager and the Coordinator of the M&E processes at BCCIC. And on behalf of the team at BCCIC, I would like to welcome you and acknowledge that I'm on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded Indigenous territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. And I invite you to take a moment to recognize and acknowledge the lands on which you reside in the chat. Before I hand it over to our moderator, I would like to share that this webinar is in Zoom webinar format, meaning that no one can see or hear you. Please feel free to use the chat function if you have any questions or concerns throughout the webinar. And there will also be a brief moment at the end of the session to ask questions. So please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen as questions arise. Please also note that there is automated closed captioning that you can turn on at the bottom of the Zoom window as well, and that this webinar is being recorded. I would now like to pass it to Dr. Laura Parisi to kick off the panel. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, or maybe good morning or evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Laura Parisi. I'm a professor in the Gender Studies Department at the University of Victoria and the current president of the Canadian Association for the Study of International Development. Thank you so much to BCCIC for inviting me to participate on this panel today. I'm really excited to hear everybody's expertise in this area. And thank you to the panelists and the audience for joining as well. As we begin, I would like to acknowledge and respect the Laconian peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Masanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. And I would like to echo the invitation to invite you to put your own territorial acknowledgement in the chat. It's a particularly important concept today that we'll be talking about in terms of decolonizing development and thinking about how feminist approaches and decolonial approaches to monitoring, evaluation, and learning are increasingly important. They always have been, but I think that we've learned, particularly during COVID, that they're more important and more urgent than ever, and certainly a topic that we've been taking up, not just in academic circles, but also in practitioner and policy circles. So with that, I would like to invite our panelists to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about your organization. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Deborah Simpson, and I'm not currently with an organization. I'm a sort of someone who's combined academic and non-academic pursuits. And most recently, I've worked with Oxfam Canada and with CODE. And I'm also the past president of the Canadian Association for the Study of International Development.
I can go next. Hi, everyone. Thanks to BCCIC for inviting me to be a part of the panel. My name is Divya Hariharan, and I work as a consultant with Core Global. Core Global is a women-led consulting firm that specializes in gender equality and social inclusion research. strategy, monitoring, evaluation, and learning, as well as capacity strengthening and technical advice. I identify myself as a monitoring, evaluation, and learning specialist, and a large part of my work has focused on women and social inclusion issues in India. I've worked on a range of intersectional themes such as women's economic empowerment, maternal newborn health, humanitarian and disaster risk reduction, as well as building private sector capacities to try and drive their ESG and DEI agenda. Very excited to be a part of the panel, and thanks for having me.
Hello, everyone. My name is Gurleen Graywall, and I'm currently serving as a board member and communications specialist with World Neighbours Canada. Previously, I acted as a project manager for World Neighbours Canada's FIT-funded project called Empowering Rural Women in Burkina Faso. And I'm also currently in my first year of law school at the University of Victoria. The organization that I work with is called World Neighbours Canada, and we work alongside partner organizations in Nepal, Honduras, and Burkina Faso to support local people as they strategize and think about how they'd like to address various development challenges. Our approach in interacting with local partner organizations and communities emphasizes that nothing is done for the people or to the people. Rather, the people themselves identify the problems they'd like to confront and the means through which they'd like to do so. Today, I'll also at various points be sharing a lot about what World Neighbours Canada learned alongside our partners in Burkina Faso while implementing our FIT-funded research project on facilitating informal sheep fattening businesses. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. We have like a really diverse range of experience here and expertise. So I'm looking forward to our conversation. I think as we begin, it's important to note that there are many definitions of feminism and lots of approaches to decoloniality. So to set the stage for our conversation today, I'd like to ask you all to tell us how you understand feminism. What does it mean to be feminist, and how you understand or define decolonial or decoloniality? Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm going to refer to a definition from the International Women's Development Agency, which might be cheating, but given there are so many different definitions, I thought it'd be useful to give one that has been well thought through. So, the basic premise of feminism is that all genders have equal rights and opportunities. But what that entails is respecting diverse women's experiences, identities, knowledge, and strengths, and striving to empower all women to realize their full rights. And what that requires then is a leveling of the playing field between genders and ensuring that diverse women and girls have the same opportunities in life available to them as boys and men. And I also looked up decolonial, but I have to say the definitions were quite abstract. So what I want to share is the definition of decolonize, which, is the action we want to take. Its original usage was obviously referring to the process of a state withdrawing from a former colony, leaving it independent. But the term has a secondary meaning, referring also to the process of deconstructing colonial ideologies regarding the superiority and privilege of Western thought and approaches.
Thank you. Divya?
Thanks, Deborah, and thanks for sort of setting the tone for how we're going to be talking about both the concepts of feminism as well as decolonization. This is something I struggle with, if not beyond the formal sort of definition of what is available in wider literature. And I worked in the space for a long time, so I do conform to a more conventional definition, which is someone who is an advocate for women's rights and gender equality, very simply put. But I also feel like there are certain key feminist principles and perspective that must also reflect in one's everyday life. And to me, being a little bit more interpretive with this involves deep listening and respecting alternative viewpoints, being fair and just in all your undertaking, recognizing and amplifying good work being done by others and really elevating it. And finally, being humane, humble, and empathetic in all that you do and how you choose to live your everyday life. I feel like this also reflects in the work that I do with Core Global on a daily basis, and we identify ourselves as intersectional feminists, where we try to understand and address, as well as overcome patriarchal structures and barriers that limit women's agency and power. We also recognize that there is intersections with race, caste, ethnicity, class, disability, sexual identity, as well as other biases, which might fuel exclusion as well as perpetuate inequality. So that's how we see ourselves as feminists, as intersectional feminists. And I also wanted to contextualize decolonization a little bit and link it to what it means to be an intersectional feminist. I'm a person of color who works in the West. I have my own sort of intersectional and unique experiences. And I feel like, therefore, it's important to critically recognize and respect what those mean. Consequently, decolonization in the context of feminism, to me, is a way of challenging dominant structures that have invisibilized the agency and experiences of women as well as other marginalized groups from the majority world. It's also about giving legitimacy to our collective as well as individual identity, work, knowledge, and different experiences as we come from different and diverse backgrounds. And lastly, just also want to acknowledge that a lot of our work as we talk about feminism and decolonization is outward facing. And there are a lot of domestic experiences within the minority world or the global north, which also need to be recognized. And I feel like my colleagues on the panel have more expertise and experience of doing that. So thank you.
So both Divya and Deborah have set a very high bar on responding to this question. Just like Divya, I remember reading this question when we received the packet for the panel and just thinking, oh, good. So we're going to start from this nice and easy place where we define feminism and decolonization, and then from there it'll just get progressively better. But I guess in thinking through these concepts, I come from a similar position as Divya in that there is never a sort of once and for all definition that you arrive at for these terms, and it is very much a lived in definition, something that you start to put on or to pick up and to recognize different objects or experiences or stories as being feminist or as doing the work of feminism or decolonization. And I guess some sort of general thoughts on what both feminism and decolonization might mean or might look like. I think of things like the practice of dismantling inequitable power relations and structures, the practice of attending to the stories of women from diverse ranges of experience, understanding that their experiences don't need to be legible or recognizable within a particular format. They don't need to be universal or relatable. I think of a process of recognizing, of articulating, of unpacking how sexism operates in the world, how it interacts with other forms of marginalization, discrimination, or dispossession, for instance. I think of a process of mutual recognition as well, of finding people who are committed to similar values, of finding good friends and cherished colleagues, people that you can think with and alongside. And I guess sort of as a closing comment on both feminism and decolonization, I always think of this quote from historian Michelle Rolfe-Cleo, who says that history is the fruit of power, but power itself is never so transparent that its analysis becomes superfluous. And I think that sometimes we begin to believe that power is is always going to be obvious or self-evident in the way that it presents, in the way that different power structures or inequities present, but that the work of unpacking and rendering transparent those operations of power, it is work, and it is something that happens slowly through these tenuous connections that we form and through the stories that we choose to share with each other or are able to share with each other. Yeah.
Great, thank you to you all. You have me to thank for that question, Gurleen. I always think it's really important for us to understand how we define things, how that informs our practice, right? That we often think these kinds of theoretical frameworks are divorced from our practice, and it is a feminist and decolonial practice to be self-reflective, right, and engage in these practices as we are, engaging in our own work. So it's an important reminder sometimes, I think, to go back and see, how are our understandings of particular concepts and ideas and experiences informing, right, our practice. So thank you very much for those thoughtful and helpful, I think, responses that will frame the next part of the webinar. Each panelist was asked to prepare a response to the question of, in your work, how do you embed more feminist and or decolonial principles and approaches to monitoring, evaluation, and learning? Each panelist has prepared a short kind of presentation, and Deborah will go first. Thank you.
Okay, so as you can see, I'm going to present a resource that Oxfam Canada spent some years developing. And it's called a guidance note on feminist meal. It's available in English, French, and Spanish. And I think BCCIC folks are going to share the link in the chat if you want to follow that through and see the full guidance note. But what I'm going to give you is just an overview. See here, I'm just trying to change I'm trying to advance my screen, but it's not advancing. Oh, there. Okay. So the first thing I want to do is just give a definition of how Oxfam Canada defines feminist meal. So the sort of starting point is that it's based on an understanding that transformative change in gender and power relations are complex and nonlinear. That feminist meal challenges us to think differently about what we consider evidence, pushes us to reconsider how that evidence is captured, and questions who gives it meaning and relevance. Thirdly, feminist meal recognizes the autonomy and independence of partners in the work we do, and is committed to a relationship of mutual accountability and shared decision-making. So the main aim of meal is that it should support the generation of knowledge that is meaningful, accessible, and also available to those who rightly own it. So the guidance note outlines 7 key foundations that are sort of principles. It's not an easy how-to, but rather it's ways of thinking about feminist meal. So the first principle is that is it an approach or lens that's based on feminist research ethics. So the main purpose is to surface a diversity of perspectives, to surface women's unique perspective, and also to surface gender-based discrimination. And surfacing these 3 elements allows us to understand and challenge structural and systemic power relations. So the second principle or foundation is that feminist meal is a process of social transformation. So adopting a feminist meal approach involves giving participants agency and ensuring that the personal experience and perspectives of those involved is transformative. So the actual process of engaging in feminist meal itself is meant to be transformative rather than just measuring transformation of, a project or a program. So in this approach, meal becomes an integral part of that social transformation rather than just a process that we include at the end of a program. So the third foundation is feminist meal shifts power to participants. So partners and participants become the owners of the process by co-designing and co-owning the meal process. That entails requiring that we think about how we share and manage that accountability, and particularly that partners are supported through capacity development so that they're empowered to lead and co-own the overall process without taking on disproportionate risk within the process. So the fourth foundation is that the role of the evaluator shifts from an expert to a facilitator that understands relationships of power. So, this is a very different understanding of meal or evaluation officers because their role is to facilitate and provide technical support so that partners can take the lead in doing project meal. And obviously that requires that meal officers or evaluators practice reflexivity. So understand their own positionality and the positions of others within the meal process. The fifth principle is that feminist meal values collective knowledge generation that is context driven. So it promotes collective knowledge for a group of people, partners, participants, donor staff, all to take part in the meal process and create a collective understanding. It acknowledges that there are many ways of knowing and seeks to unpack the privilege associated with certain ways of knowing and try and surface alternative views of women, views of marginalized people. It's also very context-driven knowledge. So, ideally that means that the knowledge that's generated is not just coming out of the program or project, but feeding the project development and implementation as well. Excuse me. And within this, feminist meal must be rooted in intersectionality. So recognize the diverse sort of power structures involved in any sort of development work, be it gender, class, age, race or ethnicity, ability, and how all of these different intersecting identities affect marginalization. So the sixth principle is that feminist meal takes a learning orientation to evaluative exercises. So it becomes a basis for evidence-based decision-making about projects and programs. And it prioritizes strategic program learning that strengthens the collective ownership of the program. Finally, but very importantly, the seventh foundation is that feminist meal must be rooted in safe programming guided by the principle of do no harm. So there's a need to implement ethical and safety standards when we work with our partners and with the people that they work with. And one of the ways that is undertaken is ensuring informed consent so that partners and participants understand what they're taking part in, and equally important, where, when, how, and why the data will be used. So that's an introduction or an overview to Oxfam Canada's approach to feminist meal. So I'll stop sharing.
Okay, thank you very much, Deborah. Divya, I believe you're next.
Can you all see my screen? Great. Let me put it on slideshow mode. Thanks, Deborah. I think Deborah's covered a large part of what I'm also going to be talking about. So as a part of our work, we're currently working with a bunch of different clients in trying to provide monitoring, evaluation, and learning support to them. And core to our work is trying to work with organizations that respect principles of feminism as well as decolonization. So several of these principles that I'm going to be talking about is based off of that work, in particular, and more recently, our work with the Obama Foundation. They have an ongoing program that works with adolescent girls and young women in trying to drive and improve education outcomes for them. As a part of that work, we're currently engaging with their grantees who are from different parts of the world. We're working with different segments and different types of target groups at different levels. And as a part of our male service offering and engagement with them, we tried to recently conduct a workshop where we tried to validate some of these male principles that I'm going to be talking about. And yeah, so just moving on to what they are, and along the same lines that what Deborah's already spoken about, we want to really highlight that it's important to talk about participation and power sharing, inclusion and intersectionality, making sure that the products as well as the dissemination effort that's undertaken is utilization focused. We're still learning and trying to come up with a better way of articulating this and not making it seem super extractive, which is what traditionally MEL or monitoring, evaluation, learning efforts are notorious for. And lastly, something Deborah also mentioned around ethics and safety, which is along the same lines as what traditional research has also adopted, but just really like taking it a step further, deepening that understanding of what do no harm looks like in different contexts and what it means as we work with different people. So just moving on to each of the principles, starting with participation and power sharing. So what does it really mean? It's about systematically ensuring that the target group that we're working with are participating in all the work that we're undertaking. There is power sharing that's happening. This involves a strong commitment and respect towards local knowledge and expertise, and making sure that the target group or the individuals or the organizations in this case that we're working with are central to the production of knowledge on issues that impact their lives directly. And just also answering the question of what this might look like in practice. This is a way to resist a top-down, more colonialist approach to knowledge creation. Again, just recognizing that MEL has traditionally been extractive, not doing that, making sure that the group is involved in co-creation of tools, processes, approaches, and also making sure that we acknowledge that they're the expert, and ensure that all the products that we put out there are grounded in their reality and their experiences. So that's the first principle. Moving on to the next one. Again, something that has been covered, which is about always accounting for intersectional and unique experiences, is making sure that the target group or the group that we're working with feels involved. And yeah, as a part of our offering and our gender equity and equality and social inclusion offering, we actively seek to understand and capture how the target group want to transform or really reflect on their realities and what their sort of complex inequalities and experience of marginalization really looks like. And in the context of the Girls' Opportunity Alliance and the Obama Foundation partnerships, we're working with grassroots organizations who are working on a range of intersectional issues with different types of adolescent girls and young women. And just also making sure that these experiences are available in an accessible format that enables decision-making and programming effort to be taken forward across all levels. So that's the second principle. Moving on to the third one, which is on ethics and safety. I'll keep this short because we've already spoken about this. This is essentially about ensuring in practice that there is voluntary participation, there is informed consent and transparency associated with how research and monitoring, evaluation, and learning efforts are undertaken. We also want to ensure confidentiality and data security, and also making sure that this is something that is contextualized and recognized as important and critical as different types of researchers in the local context are engaged, as well as really unpacking with the target group what do no harm looks like for them, and ensuring their safety and well-being. And finally, as I said, just focusing on clear dissemination practices where products that we put out there do not sit on a shelf, have value and benefit. And this is something that we see as becoming a common practice in the work that we're currently undertaking, at least with our partners. And how the information that is generated should be able to serve diverse information needs of different types of audiences. And the evidence generated is really about not just contributing to the literature that exists at the larger level of the sector, but really the people that we're trying to impact and work with. So this was a project that I was directly involved with, and I think just recognizing some of the following questions that we have planned as a part of the discussion, we have another example of what key learnings might look like as we try and adopt these principles. And I'm happy to share the link to a resource or a blog that we had put together, which is based on our experience and learning of working with the Asia Foundation Mongolia, and what their research approach looked like during COVID. So yeah, I'm happy to unpack this in the following sessions because I feel like that might be more relevant, as well as share the link to the blog, which is linked to our website, which has other resources to the wider audience. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that, Divya. I think we'll have an opportunity after Gerlene's presentation to also kind of talk about examples in which you've seen this work and so forth. So I look forward to hearing more about that. Okay, Gerline, are you ready to go?
Yes, just
Okay,
going
great.
to my PowerPoint. One moment. Right. Right. Okay, so in thinking about feminist practices of monitoring, evaluation, and learning, I'm going to dive into a recent project that World Neighbors Canada completed over the course of 15 months from May of 2021 to August of last year. World Neighbors Canada worked alongside our local partner organization in Burkina Faso, APDC, to implement a FIT-funded innovative solution. The project was called Empowering Rural Women in Burkina Faso, and as the title suggests, its primary focus and reason for being was rural women and their economic empowerment. Great. So the challenge that our project sought to address was that of persistent gender inequality in households and in the livestock smallholder sector in rural Burkina Faso. Here we found that patriarchal norms whereby masculinity was exercised and enacted through power over women and girls tended to impede their full and equitable economic participation. Through the process of our rapid gender scan, in-depth gender scan, and baseline surveys, we found that there were several key gender issues. We found that women were often limited to arduous and time-consuming labor that had little capacity to generate income, that they lacked the professional knowledge and skills that they needed to form and sustain an informal sheep fattening business. They were tacitly excluded from processes of purchasing and selling animals or going to the local cattle market with that purpose, and their labor tended to be deemed subordinate and supplementary to the labor of men. So, to address these key gender issues, our project tested a novel and gender transformative approach to facilitating a sheep fattening business. We called this approach a family-based animal fattening enterprise. Within this approach, women were the direct beneficiaries of varied professional training and gender sensitization workshops that sought to build competencies that would be relevant to advancing women's economic empowerment in households and in the livestock smallholder sector. Men, as well as adolescent boys and girls, were also provided with age and gender-specific sensitization workshops. Those workshops allowed them to critically reflect on changes to their existing ideas of gendered power relations and labor roles that were unfolding in their households through the course of the project. And they also helped them to consider the possible benefits of women's economic empowerment, how it might be a tool for positive change among people of all genders. The hypothesis that we tested in this lovely, very accessible block of text here was that if women increase their level of control in managing an informal sheep fattening business, while men and adolescent boys and girls develop an increased awareness of what the benefits of women's economic empowerment could be, then there would be an increase in women's economic participation in those spaces. So, as usual, as soon as you begin a project and as soon as you've got all of your indicators together and you think you're going to be chugging along, you start writing that first report, and then you realize that there were a whole host of things that you overlooked or that weren't nearly as nuanced as they should have been. And so this is one example of where there was a seeming obstacle that was not really an obstacle, and I'll elaborate on what I mean by that. So the ultimate outcome that we had in this project, the change that we expected would occur as a result of our hypothesis, was an improvement in women's economic empowerment. And the indicator we used to measure that outcome was the percentage of women with stable or growing animal fattening enterprises at the end of the project term. We defined a stable or growing animal fattening business as one that had the ability to maintain or increase the total number of animals in its ownership, and that could maintain or increase the total value of those animals at the end of a fattening period. To ascertain women's progress in relation to that indicator, one of the questions that we were asking was whether women could do the work that was required to maintain the number of sheep they currently owned. In the baseline sample, we found that the percentage of women and girls who reported being able to do that work was already extremely high. It was at 92%. And taking that figure on its own, it seemed difficult to reconcile the urgency and the need for this project with women's existing level of competence. It was as though being overly competent at the baseline negated the need for the project. But as we inevitably found, that figure was not the whole story. Having the ability to do the work needed to maintain one's current number of sheep was crucial to managing a sheep fattening business, but in itself, that ability wasn't sufficient to indicate that a person could manage that business. It didn't account for whether women had consistent access to adequate funds to maintain their sheep, or whether they could ensure their sheep were vaccinated. That figure didn't indicate women's capacity to secure the support of other household members in equitably distributing the labor involved in animal fattening. And it didn't tell us how much decisional authority women actually wielded in the purchase and sale of animals. So as all these other pieces started to come together, we found that the development challenge women had initially articulated didn't fit very neatly into this narrative of them beginning with little or no relevant competencies in all areas of sheep fattening and working towards increases in every indicator. Instead, the need for the project lie in this goal of increasing women's ability to harness their existing capacities in sheep fattening to bring about improvements in their economic empowerment. Sorry, I'm going to pause to drink some water. And I brought forward this example just because I found it really interesting the way that we encountered this sort of back and forth with questions when we submitted this report. And it seemed like, well, if the baseline is so fantastic, then why bother? What is the need for this project? How do we justify going about these steps and these processes if women are already starting at a place of being so well poised, seemingly, to enact these businesses? And I found it really interesting, I guess, the way in which sometimes we expect projects that have a strong focus on gender equality and women's empowerment to begin from this place where we have a narrative of these women in this poor blighted corner of the earth have nothing going for them and everything is going to change. but those narratives are very restrictive and not very reflective of what the realities on the ground tend to be, which is that women do have a robust set of capacities existing typically, even if those capacities are not recognized as such, but that they would like to have the opportunity to harness those capacities and have them recognized as knowledge and valued by others in their communities. Another interesting outcome of learning from this project, it goes without saying probably with every project, but the conditions under which our project unfolded were not ideal. They were not, in other words, conditions of complete justice, where we could ensure that there was no form of discrimination, marginalization, or oppression, whether it was on the basis of gender or some other social dimension. So within these non-ideal conditions, women had to balance a wide array of values and desires. They could have valued an increase in decisional authority in sheep purchases and sales. It could be that they desired labor roles that would allow them to be regarded as knowledge producers, as people who could share and exercise various forms of professional knowledge and skills. And it could be that women valued maintaining positive intramarital and intra-household relationships. Because those desires and values existed in this non-ideal context, the advancement of any specific valued end, like women's economic empowerment, was likely going to require considering complex links between and changes to other valued ends. And this is where my quotation comes in. So the feminist theorist Serene J. Cater writes, "It is much simpler theoretical business to know that certain forms of oppression are unacceptable than to know what to do under conditions in which multiple oppressions are likely to be affected by any single strategy, and in which appeal to precedent and existing power relations are unavoidable parts of practice." So our project's novel approach consisted of supporting women's transition to a form of sheep fattening that allowed them to structure their activities as family-based businesses. That family-based structure admitted and was premised on this idea that women were going to operate in a context where their existing relationships with the men and the boys in their households could determine, or at least affect to a great degree, their possible extent of economic participation. those relationships could affect the options that were available to women in making meaningful strides towards their economic empowerment. And notwithstanding their effects on women's potential positions as economic agents, their relationships with the men and boys in their households also held an overarching social significance for them. Those relationships were a moral and social good that the women wanted to preserve. And as we examined our data, one thing that we arrived at was this point of insisting that we fully acknowledged women's desire and intent to honor this multitude of social positions that they were inhabiting. We recognized that their desire to maintain positive intramarital and intra-household relations while working to expand the range of economic positions they might adopt didn't imply that they were blindly adhering to parochial cultural values or internalized sexism. Instead, it showed that women appreciated the complex considerations that they had to attend to while enacting any strategy for their economic empowerment under these non-ideal conditions. Right. And lastly, I think this is a point that is often made and often bears repeating because it's very important. Local gender expertise underlined everything, absolutely everything that we did in the project. To begin with, in consultation with our local partners, APDC, we were able to form a testing team that included a local gender expert to support all of the monitoring and evaluation aspects of the project's testing. We ensured that we had an adequate budget to support hiring a local gender expert. And after completing our baseline report, we found that we had additional funding that we'd initially allocated for a testing advisor subcontractor role that was going to be based in Canada, and instead found that it would be much more valuable to allocate that funding to a local gender expert in Burkina Faso. So we were able to request the transfer of those funds to a local subcontractor instead. And that allowed us to more substantively integrate that local gender expertise in all of our subsequent reporting periods as well. Yes, and I will leave it there. All right, thank you, everybody. Here we go.
Thank you so much, Gerline. It's a good example of some of the things that Deborah raised and Divya raised, and you know, the kinds of challenges and thought processes you have to go through when you're thinking about incorporating feminist and decolonial principles in projects. And also, none of you have mentioned this, but the subtext is, right, buttressing up against what donors require in terms of reporting and how to navigate all of that. And so hopefully we'll have a chance to chat about that during this webinar. So this leads into an opportunity to discuss a little further about how you see these principles, approaches, and tools better enabling women's and underrepresented voices, experiences, and viewpoints to surface. And so if you would like to elaborate a little bit on maybe projects that you've worked on, you know, your experience with implementing those tools, that would be great. Divya?
Sure. I can go first. I think one of the key lessons for us, based on the interactive session that we recently conducted with the grantees from the Obama Foundation Girls Opportunity Alliance Fund, was that it really helped us understand how progressive their monetary evaluation and learning practices and approaches already are. And for us to really exercise a lot of humility as we go in as supposed experts. So, and recognizing the fact that it's a learning journey for all of us, and no one really is an expert, and we're all here to just sort of understand what is the best approach and perspective that we can co-create in any given context. So that was one of the big sort of takeaways for us as we were trying to apply some of these principles.
Okay, thank you. Would any of the other panelists like to respond? Okay. Thank you. And this is related to the question I just posed, but more focused on decolonizing our practices. We recognize, right, that decolonizing is an ongoing process. And maybe we could reflect a bit on what you've learned or unlearned in how you or your organization do monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And it can be, over the course of your career or with organizations you've worked with, because I think, we reflected a little bit at the beginning about what does decolonizing mean, right, to us, and maybe reflect a little bit about how your experiences in implementing these tools have produced new viewpoints and also, asked you to kind of reconsider maybe previous ways of having done development work. Divya, you have your hand up again, or did you? Okay, great, thank you.
I do have my hand up again. I think one of the learnings and takeaways from our work that I previously spoke about and we wrote a blog about was just dropping the sort of conventional urgency about what like research and MEL really means, and just based on what you said earlier, Laura, about how it's really dictated and governed by donors and grant makers and what the MEL really represents for them. So we tried to adapt a more like considerate and empathetic and practical approach to undertaking research in Mongolia, as well as it was a more considerate and slower pace than desirable or was in tandem with the project timelines. So we also made the collective effort with the organizations that we were working with to push back timelines with the donors. That also helped us sort of strengthen our relationship with the team that was working locally, and also like maybe strengthen potential future opportunities that we might be able to explore in a given context that we were working in. So that was one big learning for us.
Thank you. Deborah?
Just unmute myself there. I had a couple of things I wanted to say in response to this question. And one of them is probably quite obvious, but building rapport and relationships with partners and those we work with is a really important step and creates a foundation for collaboration, but that it takes time and intentionality. So, it's not just going to happen. It's a choice to adopt these principles and to adopt a utilization, learning focused, participatory approach to gender transformative approach to monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And that the other thing I just wanted to highlight is that it definitely runs counter to more traditional approaches to MEAL, which are grounded in oversight and accountability. And so, it's political to choose a feminist MEAL approach. And it challenges that idea, and I think Divya spoke about it as being extractive. It really challenges, older understandings of the independence and the objectivity of MEAL when you push to participate with partners and with project participants rather than being the experts that come in and extract information and data and write reports based on that extraction.
Caroline?
Yeah, just I really liked what Deborah had to say about the process of integrating feminist or decolonial practices or ideas into your monitoring and evaluation as being a question of intentionality and of relationality as well. And in that respect, especially on the relationship piece, I think one place where World Neighbors was sort of well poised in this project to to harness that existing relationship and to deepen the scope of that was in the fact that we had over a decade of prior experience working with our partners in Burkina Faso. So there was this sense of trust and this sense of when, I suppose, if we ever received some kind of communication from the donors or from the funding agency, it was always a question of not us telling APDC, this is what's going to happen, and this is the criteria, and this is how we'd like to proceed. It was very much a question of saying, this is the information we've gotten, and this is roughly what we need to provide to fit for meeting their requirements. And what do you think the best way of going about that might be? And over the course of our entire testing process, we had little prior experience with projects that had a strong focus on testing a specific research question or a hypothesis. So we tried to remain very flexible and responsive to this need for modifications to the monitoring and evaluation plan. And during every single reporting period, we always went back to the set of core survey questions that had furnished our PMF data, and we considered whether any revisions to that might be useful. And some of the things we tried to do to streamline the process of data collection, we wanted to reduce the burden of data collection for everyone involved by eliminating redundancies or these unnecessary contextual questions. So that was something that our local gender experts were really instrumental in helping us with, was to just say that if you ask people these questions, they're going to be annoyed. So you should probably avoid steering in this direction, and that was very helpful. Yeah.
So thank you all for that. I would just share that it's something that I've been struggling with myself in my own work, that the qualitative data is much more interesting, important, and relevant than the quantitative data that is required by so many funders. And for me, I think the big learning process has also been to use my own privilege, right, to negotiate what those results look like to, right, the donors themselves, because I think that's an important part. Is so much of government funding and other foundation funding is still stuck in this model of like just numbers, right? And as you say, it doesn't really show the whole story, and it's not necessarily useful to the communities in which we're working and collaborating with folks there. So and it's just something I've been thinking about a lot over the course of my own career. Okay, so thank you all very much for those responses. And then I would like to open this up to first ask the audience if they would like to chime in on a question to the audience. You could put your thoughts in the chat box. What do you perceive as the opportunities and gaps of feminist or decolonial approaches to monitoring, evaluation, and learning? Maybe even based on what you've learned here today, or things that you've been thinking about in your own development practices. It'd be great to hear some other viewpoints on what you see are the gaps and the opportunities for that. And Mary has reposted the question in the chat. In the meantime, we can take some questions from the audience, and I see that there's a queue here in the Q&A. And so I will just start in the order that they've been received to the panelists. The first question is, can you speak to some approaches of how you've navigated power imbalances within groups involved in your monitoring, evaluation, and learning processes? How have you ensured equitable, diverse, and proportional representation in the decision-making processes? Thank you very much to whoever posed that question. It's an excellent one, and it's a really important one, because we cannot just assume, right, that all women are equal in a group, or those sorts of things. So would anybody like to take a stab at answering this question? Divya?
Yeah, sure. I can speak about my experience of working in rural Uttar Pradesh, which is one of the states in India. And there are like several levels of intersectional experiences that not just women, but different types of communities that live their experience. So it's always not always easy to navigate through not just MEL processes, but like basic programmatic work as well. And that's something that even Gurleen was highlighting, where they go hand in hand. It's not one or the other. In that, what we realized was what was critically important was community level dialogue and engagement with decision makers and leaders within the community. Their buy-in was super important, and how you navigate and have those conversations was, as you said, Laura, super like political, and informed by a lot of like deep thinking, conversations, reflections that we had to have even before we started engaging with them. So that's one way of trying or attempting to tackle like some level of power imbalances within groups. And then in terms of how there was diverse, equitable representation, I think as we were organizing workshops or like sessions where we were trying to co-create approaches or tools, we made sure that we were inviting different types of people, different people who had stake in the process. It wasn't always easy because even to bring people from diverse background with like opposing ideologies and perspectives was a challenge. But we tried our best, weren't always successful. So that's also something to acknowledge and recognize. So that's one experience that we had as a part of my work.
Great, thank you. Deborah, Gurleen? Okay, I will move on to the next. Oh, sorry, Gurleen.
Sorry, a bit late in getting
Delayed response. Okay.
Yeah. I guess one thing I was thinking about in terms of power imbalances or diversity of experiences within a particular group, one thing that we observed in attending to the experiences of women going through professional training sessions was that there were some women in this group who had moderate to low levels of literacy and literate numeracy, but the majority of the women in the group had little or no formal education and very low levels or just no levels at all of literacy and literate numeracy. And within that range of experience, we were trying to figure out how, or rather APDC was trying to figure out and was communicating to us what they were doing, how to go about ensuring that women were able to robustly participate in these professional training sessions. And one of the things that had happened was that in some of the training sessions, they would have people coming in from larger cities to facilitate the sessions. And the facilitators would be a little bit frustrated with that range of experience. And they would say, well, we're not sure how to provide training for these women, given that they're sort of all over the map in terms of where they're beginning and where they would like to go. And a couple of strategies that APDC found were useful in being able to facilitate women's participation were providing more pictorially presented information and having other household members attend these sessions so that they could explain to the women with lower levels of literacy how they might integrate some of the practices that the facilitators in these professional training sessions were sharing in oral formats. So if, for instance, a facilitator was talking about the importance of providing robust financial records or of even keeping financial records, those were things that other household members were able to communicate to women and ensure that they had some sort of buy-in, or that they felt like this is something that might be important to me and that I might try to work towards, even if it is only in an oral capacity.
Great, thank you for sharing that. It's an excellent example of how we often rely on particular methods because they've been normalized, and the need to pivot, right? And as all of you brought up earlier about the need to contextualize knowledge and knowledge dissemination and production through that. Okay, the next question I have from the audience is, I would love to know what each of you are doing to include trans women and other marginalized genders in feminist and decolonial approaches to MEL, knowing that there are a kaleidoscope of genders across geography and cultures? Thank you for that excellent question. Deborah?
Thanks, Laura. I think this is a really important question. And I think it's something that is raised through the Feminist International Assistance Policy, but is not well addressed by most NGOs. And I think part of the reason for that is, the political and legal context in which work is being done. For example, when I was working at Oxfam, we had sexual and reproductive health and rights projects in Southern and East Africa, working with partners there, obviously. But trans issues and issues of abortion, both of those issues were very sensitive topics. And I think this is such a difficult issue because there's a need to address, all meanings of gender, but at the same time, there's the question of whether Northern views are being imposed in the global South. And so I think, where it becomes really important is to have those conversations with partners, and for partners to be having those conversations with participants, so that it opens up, safe spaces for dialogue and participation. So I'm not giving much of an example of how this is being addressed, but I just wanted to highlight that the danger if you're working in, say, Mozambique, is that partner organizations will turn around and say, well, that's not our local culture to view gender in its full diversity. So I think it's a very tricky and important issue.
Thank you, Deborah. And also with regards to sexual identity and orientation, we have to be mindful that it is criminalized in 77 countries in the world. So when you're trying to work with the principle of do no harm, it is extraordinarily difficult and raises a lot of ethical and moral issues in the work. Gurleen or Divya? Divya?
I think Gurleen had her hand up before.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was up from the previous question.
Sorry, just a very small add-on to what Deborah was saying. I think sometimes when you go into a particular country and you try to import this language of what gender looks like, or you try to import this language of what constitutes a particular gendered position, that can be very alienating for people in a local environment, and they can experience that language as an affront or as something that does try very much to sort of cut and paste what a Northern understanding of the full diversity or full spectrum of gender is onto there. And I guess another thing too is just that the fact that particular language is not being used to describe gendered positions doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a variety or spectrum of gendered positions being articulated and practiced and expressed by people on the ground. But also that exploring all of the diverse articulations of gendered experience in a particular place, while a valuable and valid project, might not be something that people are interested in the short term or immediately. so that if there's this effort from people in the global north to try to bring that into every project as being at the forefront, that people might experience that as I guess trying to set a certain agenda of priorities, whereas they might want to pursue their projects differently and take their fences one at a time.
Okay, thank you very much, Gurleen. Divya?
Oh, yeah, just echoing what Gurleen very eloquently put. I think the struggle is also that projects mandate usually don't specify how to engage with diverse gender identities adequately. It's very governed by like priorities and what is important. Like given that we're a consulting organization and we're responding to like donor needs or client requirements, so there are certain limitations around this. And I just wanted to acknowledge that because this is something that we recently spoke about even within our team, and really like reflecting on what like intersectional means for us and how we can really like push some of these critical aspects, especially given our work is a couple of levels removed from what's happening on the ground. So there is some scope for influencing it, and also recognizing that there are diverse gender and sexual identities that exist at the levels of programming or communities or target groups that we want to work with. So just wanted to highlight that.
Thank you. I think that's important too, about like trying to understand like how those directives work out, because like, for example, when Global Affairs Canada does the gender assessment score for the projects they're evaluating, they're only looking at data indicators that intersect, you know, how many men and women and maybe age, right? And that's it. That's the limit of the intersectionality. So it doesn't give us a very broad, right, context even to work with. So understanding on that end is really important when you think about clients and donors and so. The next question is, and this leads into that, some Canadian reporting or research questions can be quite sensitive for a local context, even if important. This may shake up the local status quo, which is maybe paternalistic or colonial for decisions for a need for change, even if there are lots of local support. Are these reporting details delayed, left out, or nuanced somehow else? So I take that question to mean, how do you deal with potentially controversial issues, even if there's support in the local context for that in terms of the reporting? Anyone want to take a stab at answering that? Okay, Divya?
Maybe Deborah can go first. I saw her unmute.
Not everybody
I
has to
was
answer.
point out you had your hand up, Divya.
Yeah.
No problem. Thanks, Deborah. I was just going to talk about it in the context of some of the work that we're doing with innovators who are working in difficult humanitarian or emergency settings. And this extends even beyond gender in some cases, because this is just really about lives that they're trying to save and just doing their best with the work that they're hoping to do. In that context, they have certain expectations from donors in terms of meeting certain monitoring requirements against like key indicators that they need to report on, which might talk about how they're improving lives or what key outcomes might look like. And in that context, what we have tried to do is really be a passionate advocate for, as advisors and people, as you previously mentioned, where we're like positioned well to have those like negotiations with donors where we're able to communicate that this kind of information isn't really feasible to collect. You can't be collecting census level data on how minorities, how many minorities there are in a particular emergency context who are benefiting from a response that they are able to receive. So that's something that we have tried to push for. We've tried to also come up with like more qualitative ways of addressing some of these issues where we're able to highlight, do stories of change or case studies, or have like more focus groups with certain key members from the communities to try and nuance this a little bit, but it's not always easy, and it's not always as streamlined, or like there isn't like one solution to how this can be achieved. But yeah, as I said, like just being passionate advocates has somewhat worked for us to try and drive this sort of just try to drive the point home that it's not always possible to collect data that might seem important but really isn't.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple more questions in the queue, so I will move on to that. The next question, the asker thanks all of you for your insightful responses. There's multi parts to this question. I'm just going to ask the first one. How does one differentiate between post-colonial approaches and decolonial approaches in knowledge production? This sounds like a PhD candidate question, but I invite you to share your thoughts. Deborah?
I think like taking a decolonial approach acknowledges that these colonial structures and privileges and power structures are still in place. So I think we're not in a phase where we can take a post-colonial approach to knowledge production, because those colonial structures, the preferencing of sort of northern knowledge, the power structures that make it very difficult for participants and partners in the global south to have their voices heard in the global north, mean that, you know, that's part of the reason that we need to take a decolonial approach to actually recognize the ongoing power structures that, you know, emerge out of colonialism.
Thank you. Anybody else? I would just add that post-colonial sort of had some sort of separation between the global north and the global south, as if, you know, colonial processes weren't ongoing in the global north. Like it's assumed some sort of separation, and that somehow colonialism is done or over with, and so forth. And I think decoloniality gives us a lens through which to understand how they're all connected through the global north and the global south, and our worldwide processes that you talked about with structures. But that's the way I also view that distinction between post-colonial is that, and decolonial, that allows us to make more of a shift to look internally, as well as our ongoing processes. Because post-colonial to me often refers to like kind of the events of independence in the 60s and the 70s and 80s, and sort of benchmarks that as the kind of period of decolonization. But, you know, like you said, Deborah, now it allows us to decoloniality acknowledges the ongoing legacies and continuing processes in all areas of the world, right? It's not just about colonizing powers leaving, you know, and deoccupying territories in a physical, right, kind of way. Okay. The next part of that question is in development, what constitutes development, right? Misreading this, where what constitutes development is predominantly through Western understanding and a particular dominant understanding of development. Are feminist decolonial approaches in monitoring, evaluation, and learning compatible with the dominant paradigm that facilitate implementation of development programs? And I think you've already answered this to some degree, like how can these approaches act as a transformative tool to the entire development practice? So do you see any areas where feminist and decolonial approaches are compatible with mainstream or current modes of development? I think that's the summary of the question, and how can they be, how can these approaches be transformative? Deborah?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at this. I think, the definition of feminist meal is that it be gender transformative, so that the actual practices of meal transform those relationships between partners, donors, and participants. So there's all sorts of different aims of development programs, and obviously, economic models and capitalist models dominate. But I think organizations that are using feminist meal, like Oxfam Canada, are focusing on community-led development that responds to the priorities of women and girls and other marginalized groups. So I don't think it's one or the other. I think there is room within sort of the development industry for that more transformative approach, and that good feminist meal can be a part of that rather than be oppositional to it.
Okay, thank you, Deborah. Divya or Gurleen?
I mean, this might be a little bit provocative, but I also feel like it is in some ways, or in some areas of, or like sub areas of the development within the international development sector, it is becoming somewhat the dominant paradigm as well, where people are choosing to engage with it more, recognizing it more, talking about it more. And I think in the last 10 years of me having worked in this space, it's moved beyond from being like gender being this sort of like thing that you sprinkle over programs. There is intention and there is cognizance of like trying to integrate it a little bit more systematically, and like recognizing that it is a technical area that needs attention and time. So I think that's also my perspective, skewed because of the work that I'm undertaking. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for one last question quickly so that we wrap up on time. We have about 6 minutes left. This question is, can you give specific examples and approaches to make correction or revision in your measurement for collecting accurate data when errors in baseline data, such as indicators, are identified? And what is your experience or learning in using qualitative methods through interviews, focus groups, stories as complementary to quantitative methods of data collection and analysis? That's a fantastic question. Thank you. Gurleen?
Yes, so we did a lot of this in our reporting, and I guess one of the ways in which we were simply very fortunate was that in working with FIT, we had an amazing program officer who was very understanding and who made being a passionate advocate easy in some senses, in that we would often come up with numbers that were entirely contrary to our predictions. So for instance, one of the things that we came up against was that we were trying to measure women's capacities in several areas of professional competency relating to sheep fattening. And we were doing this in the context of a family-based animal fattening business, which meant that we were also trying to figure out whether women were able to garner increasing support from their other household members in managing these businesses. So a lot of our questions centered around asking women whether they could exercise a particular capacity on their own, or whether they had developed a particular competence such that they, as an individual, could go out and do this thing, whatever that skill might be. And at the same time, we were asking this set of questions around whether they were receiving increased support from their household members. And we found that some of the data regarding support turned out to be contrary, because women reported receiving, or women reported having a decreased capacity to care for animals on their own. And we found out through our focus group discussions that it wasn't because they were not able to care for animals on their own that they were reporting doing that less, but rather because they were receiving increased support from other household members, that their willingness or the degree to which they engaged in these tasks alone was just decreasing now. So we found that sometimes things that you think on the face of it are going to be very clear when you send out this survey are interacted with in interesting ways on the ground, and that you can unknowingly set up these conflicting normative positions where you say, well, you should be entirely self-sufficient, but also you should be getting a tremendous amount of support from every person in your household. And that sometimes it seems very, very simple when you spell it out like that, but it was difficult to recognize in putting together sort of the initial set of indicators. And that was a pivot that we had to make midway through our reporting. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I think you really rightfully pointed out the tensions in trying to figure out what indicators should be, and quantitative and qualitative, and how those inform one another, and the need to be adaptable and flexible, right, as you're working through. I'd like to thank all the panelists for this illuminating conversation. I learned a lot, and I'm now going to turn it over to Laura for the closing remarks.
Yes, thank you so much to our wonderful moderator and panelists. This has been absolutely amazing. I know that I have enjoyed it, and I'm sure that all of the attendees have as well. Thank you to everyone for attending. Please watch your inbox for a post-event survey. That really helps us improve our programming. And you'll as well receive a recording of today's session and mentioned resources. And I hope that everyone has a wonderful rest of your day or evening or afternoon. And thank you again to all of our panelists and moderator. Bye, everyone.